Welcome. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we will take up a deceptively simple question: who are adolescents? This is an integrative review that brings together four perspectives on the adolescent years: developmental, neurological, relational, and cultural. Each offers a partial answer, and together they form a fuller portrait. This presentation is designed for graduate students in counseling, and throughout it, we will resist the habit of seeing adolescence as a problem to be managed. Instead, we will treat it as a period of remarkable capacity, plasticity, and possibility. Let us orient ourselves to the journey ahead. Adolescents occupy one of the most consequential and most misunderstood periods of the human lifespan. They are neither older children nor unfinished adults. They are individuals navigating a dense convergence of biological maturation, cognitive expansion, relational reorganization, and cultural meaning-making. This review synthesizes theoretical and empirical scholarship to address one guiding question: who are adolescents developmentally, neurologically, relationally, and culturally? We will move through each of those four dimensions in turn, examining cognition and identity, brain reorganization and plasticity, attachment, peers, and family, and finally, identity, meaning, and community within culture. We begin by trying to define adolescence, which has long resisted a tidy definition. More than a century ago, G. Stanley Hall characterized adolescence as a time of inevitable storm and stress. Decades later, Arnett reconsidered that thesis and reached a more measured conclusion. While adolescents do show modest elevations in conflict and risk behavior, these tendencies are neither universal nor inevitable. Most young people, in fact, traverse adolescence without serious disturbance. Holding this in mind matters for our work because it sets a tone of realistic expectations rather than an anticipated crisis. The boundaries of adolescence have also expanded over time. The World Health Organization defines adolescence as ages 10 to 19. The American Academy of Pediatrics extends it through age 21, and Sawyer and colleagues argue for a broader span of 10 to 24. Two converging trends drive this expansion. Puberty now begins earlier than it did a century ago, while the social markers of adulthood, such as finishing education, marriage, and parenthood, arrive considerably later. Researchers often divide the period into early adolescence, roughly ages 10 to 14, middle adolescence, from 15 to 17, and late adolescence, from 18 into the early 20s. These debates are not merely academic. They shape laws, services, and the length of time young people receive developmentally appropriate support. Turning to the developmental dimension, we start with cognition. Piaget's formal operational stage, beginning around age 11, enables adolescents to reason about abstract principles such as justice, love, and freedom without needing concrete examples, and to engage in hypothetical deductive reasoning and metacognition. Contemporary scholars, however, add an important qualification. Formal operational thinking is neither universal nor uniformly applied. It is shaped by domain-specific knowledge and cultural context. Elkind also described what he called adolescent egocentrism, including the imaginary audience and the personal fable, which help explain the heightened self-consciousness and the sense of uniqueness that are so common in this period. The second developmental achievement is identity. Erikson identified identity versus role confusion as the defining psychosocial crisis of adolescence and described the period as a psychological moratorium, a sanctioned pause for exploration before commitment. Marcia then operationalized Erikson's theory into four identity statuses, namely diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement, organized around the dimensions of exploration and commitment. More recent work refines this picture. Brange and colleagues found that identity synthesis is linked to proactive exploration, while identity confusion is linked to ruminative exploration. And as Coate observed, most identity formation occurs in young adulthood, reinforcing the value of an extended conception of adolescence. Now to the neurological dimension. Advances in neuroimaging have moved the field away from simple narratives of deficiency and toward dynamic accounts of differential maturation and heightened plasticity. Early models attributed adolescent risk-taking to immature frontal lobe function, and there is real evidence behind this, since the prefrontal cortex is among the last brain regions to mature, both structurally and functionally. But as we will see, this is only part of the story, and the more complete account is considerably more hopeful. The dual systems model offers a useful framework. It describes two interacting neural systems that mature on different timelines. The socio-emotional system, rooted in limbic and subcortical regions such as the ventral striatum, nucleus accumbens, and amygdala, is highly reactive to reward and novelty and matures early in adolescence. The cognitive control system, centered in the lateral prefrontal cortex, matures more gradually into the mid-20s. The temporal gap between them creates heightened vulnerability to sensation seeking, which peaks in middle adolescence. A useful metaphor is a fully responsive emotional accelerator paired with a still developing set of brakes. That said, critics such as Pfeiffer and Allen caution against neuroreductionism, reminding us that social context, learned strategies, and compensatory mechanisms also shape neural patterns. This is where the neurological story becomes genuinely encouraging. Puberty initiates synaptic pruning, myelination, and neuronal reorganization, all of which amplify the adolescent's responsiveness to the environment and facilitate experiential learning. This heightened plasticity does render adolescents sensitive to adversity, but it also constitutes a critical window for intervention and prevention. Reward sensitivity, too, has been reconsidered. Galvin argued that dopaminergic reactivity can be redirected toward positive, health-promoting behaviors, serving adaptive functions across many contexts. Here is the key insight for our profession. The same neural systems that heighten susceptibility to risk also heighten responsiveness to enriching relationships and well-timed support. In other words, counseling is developmentally aligned with how adolescent brains are built to learn. We come now to the relational dimension. Adolescence is marked by a reorganization of the young person's social world. The intense reliance on caregivers that defines early childhood gives way to a more differentiated relational landscape, one in which peers assume growing importance. Crucially, this does not mean the family disappears. The family remains a vital source of security, even as the relationship is renegotiated on new terms. Attachment theory helps us understand this reorganization. Delgado and colleagues found that secure attachment predicts effective peer relationships grounded in communication, support, intimacy, and trust, and that securely attached adolescents navigate conflict with parents openly, confident that the relationship will endure. A vital distinction follows here. Healthy autonomy is not the severing of the parent-adolescent bond. It is self-governance that develops within warm, connected relationships. Autonomy accompanied by connectedness predicts higher quality relationships, whereas detachment is associated with poorer adjustment. The counseling implication is clear. Our goal is not to facilitate separation, but to support adolescents in becoming more fully themselves while remaining connected to the people who matter to them. Peers, meanwhile, become more salient and a primary developmental environment. They increasingly serve attachment functions, offering emotional support, a safe haven, and a base for exploration. This shift is visible in the brain. Cheen and colleagues found that the mere presence of peers increased adolescent risk-taking by heightening activity in reward-related regions such as the ventral striatum and orbitofrontal cortex. But social sensitivity is also an opportunity. Telzer and colleagues demonstrated that parental presence can buffer adolescent risk-taking and redirect reward sensitivity toward safer behavior. The adolescent, in short, is a fundamentally relational being, and relationships are not a distraction from development. They are its very engine. Our final dimension is culture, And here we recognize that adolescence is a cultural construction. Culture determines when adolescence begins and ends, what tasks it entails, and what it means to come of age. Vygotsky held that higher mental functions are mediated by culturally transmitted tools, language, and social interaction. Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory situates the developing adolescent within nested layers of family, school, community, and broader cultural and historical context. Even the milestones we discussed earlier, such as formal operational reasoning and identity exploration, are realized differently across cultural settings, which underscores the limited cultural scope of any stage-based universalism. For adolescents of color, identity formation includes developing ethnic racial identity. Finney described a progression that moves from an unexamined identity, marked by little exploration of one's group membership, through a period of active exploration and questioning, toward an achieved identity that is integrated and multidimensional. The empirical case for attending to this is strong. A meta-analysis by Rivas Drake and colleagues found that positive ethnic racial affect is associated with better psychosocial, academic, and health outcomes. And Umana Taylor and colleagues demonstrated, in a randomized trial, that the school-based identity project increased ethnic racial identity exploration and resolution. This positions ethnic racial identity as a developmental competency that counselors can intentionally support. Indigenous scholarship reframes the person in a fundamentally relational way. While mainstream models often center the bounded, individuated self, many indigenous epistemologies understand identity and well-being as constituted through relationships with family, community, land, ancestors, and the spiritual world. Ulrich's Indigenous Connectedness Framework holds that well-being arises from environmental, community, family, intergenerational, and spiritual connectedness, all of which operate in synergy. For an adolescent, this means that the self cannot be assessed apart from the web of relationships that sustains it. The protective power of cultural connection is not merely theoretical. It appears clearly in the data. Chandler and Lalonde found that youth suicide rates were markedly lower in First Nations communities that had actively preserved their cultures, a phenomenon they termed cultural continuity. Hallett and colleagues extended this, showing that community-level knowledge of Indigenous language was independently associated with reduced youth suicide. And Henson and colleagues found that strong cultural identity was linked to better mental health, higher self-esteem, lower substance use, and greater academic achievement among American Indian and Alaska Native youth. The message for counselors is profound. Supporting an Indigenous adolescent's connection to language, ceremony, land, and community is not an adjunct to clinical care. It may be among the most powerful protective interventions available. Let us now gather the implications for practice into 4 core principles. First, developmental patience. Because identity formation continues into the 20s and cognitive control matures gradually, we should resist expecting premature closure and calibrate our expectations to each young person's developmental reality. Second, counseling is developmentally well-timed. The adolescent brain's heightened sensitivity to reward, relationships, and experiences means that enriching, emotionally meaningful interventions exert an outsized influence. Third, the relationship is the primary mechanism of change. Because adolescents are fundamentally relational beings, the therapeutic relationship itself is a primary mechanism, and strengthening secure connections addresses development at its source. And fourth, culturally responsive practice is non-negotiable. For adolescents of color and Indigenous youth, identity and cultural connectedness are central engines of well-being, and we must understand presenting concerns within a historical and structural context, rather than as individual deficits. These principles also shape how we prepare future counselors. Counselor educators can ground their preparation in 3 complementary frameworks. Experiential learning creates conditions of warmth, engagement, and felt safety that align with how adolescent brains are built to learn. Indigenous ways of knowing center the knowledge of the communities most affected and recognize cultural and spiritual connection as legitimate protective factors. And universal design for learning provides concrete supports while scaffolding gradually toward abstraction, honoring the uneven and context-dependent nature of cognitive development. Together, these frameworks equip practitioners to meet adolescents as whole people. As we move toward the conclusion, let us draw the four dimensions back together. Adolescents are young people in the midst of becoming. They are equipped with newly abstract minds, brains tuned for learning and connection, relationships in active reorganization, and identities taking shape within particular cultural worlds. The cognitive and psychosocial dimension gives them the capacity to ask who they are. The neurological dimension provides a plastic, reward-sensitive substrate. The relational dimension supplies the connections that enable growth. And the cultural dimension offers the systems of meaning that sustain well-being. Understood together, these perspectives reframe adolescence not as a problem to be managed, but as a period of remarkable openness. For counselors, reframing is an invitation to meet adolescents with developmental humility, relational warmth, and cultural respect. I will leave you with a single unifying idea. The conditions that support adolescent growth are the conditions of authentic human connection. Developmental humility honors the extended and variable timeline of becoming. Relational warmth leverages the brain's heightened responsiveness to relationships. And cultural respect centers identity, community, and historical context in every encounter. These are not three separate techniques. They are facets of a single, respectful way of being with a young person. Additional research that integrates neurological, relational, and cultural perspectives and centers the knowledge of the communities most affected remains warranted. Thank you for your attention and for the care you will bring to the adolescents you serve.